I worked on acromite back in discovery. I wish it was 15 years, but it was closer to 20 or 25 years. I don't want to say, but anyway, I'll go through these really quick. I know you don't want to be talking about our own chemicals here, but okay, so we'll talk about kenemite really quick. It's the site of action. It's a 20B miticide. It's not systemic or translaminar. It depends on contact activity mostly, so you have to keep that in mind when you use it. The selectivity is good. It's relatively harmless to predaceous mites and beneficials. It has a fast knockdown, generally in 1 day or less, and residual activity is very good. Usually it'll last a couple of weeks on the foliage. So it has, again, rapid knockdown, safe to beneficials, and controls all the life stages. Acromite is shown here. This is the one that I worked on, and I apologize ahead of time. I'm going to talk a little bit, about other things that have to do with miticides in general, and pretty much it's from the work that I did with acromite when we were developing it. So anyway, it's a carbazate. It's a neuroactive compound. Right now it's classified as UN, but it's going to soon possibly be put in the same class as kenemite. We're not sure on that yet, but there's some testing going on in Europe that will confirm or not confirm that. So it's active on all the life stages. It doesn't... What was that? Did I just see that? Anyway, it's
just
active.
seeing if you're awake out there.
It's active on all the life stages. It has no effect on predatory mites. As a matter of fact, they release it in tunnels and stuff, and you can spray it right over the top. So it's one of the very safest ones for predatory mite release. It works in 1 to 3 days. I would say kenemite's probably a little bit faster. It has 14 to 21 days residual. It works, again, on all the life stages. You can see the eggs up there, the larvae, the nymphs, and the adults. When we initially screened this, we literally had a whole bunch of chemistry that worked good against, usually when you talk about miticides, you see some that will control eggs, some that will control motile forms, and there's a few now that will control all the life stages, and acromite is one of those. So what you see here is tetranocid mites, and you guys are more concerned with the ones on the left there, the two-spotted spider mite. The adult is on the top picture here, and you could see that the overwintering life stage are these females that are orange colored during the winter, and on the bottom you see a picture of the eggs. Now on a European red mite or a citrus red mite, pinonacid mite, you can see that they're quite different. They do not overwinter as a motile form, but they overwinter as an egg there. Now the egg is essentially different. This was the point for showing this slide. The egg on a tetranocid mite is what we call like a summer egg. It's a very thin membrane, and it's quite different than a pinonacid egg because a pinonacid egg has to overwinter, and it has several membranes on the outside. It's pretty much impervious. This is a picture of a structure that develops in the two-spotted spider mite egg after, say, 60 hours or so. When the egg starts to mature, this organ on the inside will penetrate the eggshell, and in this way, acromite, if it's sprayed on the outside of the egg, can get inside the egg, and it actually kills the developing embryo. It's actually a respiratory system. Now, this was one trial that I did, and I apologize for this. It's a little bit weird looking, but you have two types of coverage here. When you talk about spray coverage, the one on the right with all the little dots on it, I simulated coverage. So the white is complete coverage on the right column here. On the bottom, 100% coverage. Imagine your leaf that has the pesticide coated all over the whole outside of it with no misses at all. On the very top, you have only 25% coverage, so your black is untreated leaf, your white spots are this. Imagine this representation on the right is if your sprayer wasn't working too good and the droplets are only hitting certain parts of the leaf. So that's what I'd call bad spray coverage. On the left, you have the same amount of area covered, but it's all in one piece. So what you'll get on the left is if, for instance, you went to spray your leaf on a strawberry and it provided refuge. In other words, maybe two leaves stuck together, you didn't get the pesticide to the other side of the leaf, it's a tight canopy, laying right on the ground, difficult to cover, so you may have the possibility of getting varying amounts of refuge underneath the leaf. And that's what that represents on the left. So you could see most of it's black. You have 25% coverage, only the white section, 50% coverage, 75% coverage, and then total, 0% coverage on the bottom. So what we did was we took acromite, which is the code number on the top, and when we looked at refuge, the left column, in other words, what happens when you don't get the spray to the bottom of the leaf. Not poor coverage from the sprayer, but actually what happens when you miss the leaf completely to varying degrees. And you could see on the right-hand side, this column here, the LC50, the lethal concentration to kill 50% of the mites, it's very low. You got a point, right? Yeah, on the right-hand side here. Okay, so anyway, what we've got here is if you have 100% coverage, you could see that after 4, 5, and 6 days of exposure, there's 4 days, 5 days, and 6 days of exposure, you've actually attained most of your control with 100% coverage. When you go to 75% coverage, you can see that it varies a little bit, but instead of taking 25 parts per million, it takes up closer to 50 parts per million, and so forth when you get out to 50% coverage. So the point here is when you get down to poor coverage and not hitting the leaf, you can see that now all of a sudden you went from, say, 12 parts per million to do the job, you're all the way up to a couple of hundred parts per million to do that same job when you start knocking out, you've got refuge on the leaf versus bad spray coverage. Now the next slide, this is referring to the spotted coverage on the right-hand side, and what that is showing is that it's not refuge, but it's just poor spray coverage. In other words, if your spray doesn't completely cover the leaf. So you can see that you still have an issue if you don't have any coverage, but it's less acute if you go back to this one. It's less acute than if you completely miss the leaf altogether.
Can I jump in there real quick?
Sure.
So all year long we heard coverage, and it's been the buzzword, but I haven't had anybody yet tell me how many gallons of water. I've heard 60 gallons. I've heard 100 gallons. I've heard 500. In California, they put 500 gallons, Josh, to control mice. The bottom line, it's not a magic number of gallons to get control. It's coverage. If you don't get coverage, you don't get the mites. Whatever your spray system may be different than your neighbor's spray system. You have to either use a good surfactant or you have to get something to break the water surface temperature. Sometimes you may need to buffer your water because you have hard water. All those go into it. The pH of the product goes into it as well. So go ahead.
So what I'm trying to get across here is that depending on how much coverage you got, you can see that quickly you can imagine that the first count for mites was taken at 4 days after exposure. If you think about 1 day or 2 days after exposure, like the trial that we did in Florida for the resistance, it would be easy to see that that last bar, if the coverage was poor, would be way, way up to over a couple of hundred parts per million, and the deal is you have a failure. So that's what I'm trying to point out here. So what I talked about in this slide was if you look at the LC50, how much concentration is needed to actually control the different life stages, it takes much more. You could see the LC50 95 on the bottom over here. It only takes a fraction of a part per million. This is a contact treatment. It only takes a fraction of a part per million to kill larvae, very young larvae. It takes a little bit more to kill older mites, and once you get up to eggs, it takes 25 parts per million. So 93% of your chemical could be directed at trying to knock the eggs out versus the young motile forms. The other thing is an egg. Once an egg is on that leaf, there's two types of spray: residual or contact. Contact is where you actually target the egg, or you target the larvae, you target the adult. And residual is when you don't spray the adult or larvae or egg, but it moves onto that treated surface afterwards. It's still alive. In this case, a larvae or an adult can walk onto a treated surface and be killed later. But an egg cannot do that. An egg is usually laid underneath the leaf. It's usually laid in an area where there's a lot of webbing, okay? It does not move. So if you miss that spray hitting that egg on the inner part of that plant underneath where the leaf is tented, inside the canopy, you can see that it's going to take much more pesticide in there, so quickly you can have an issue. The point is, you know, eggs are the toughest to control, they're the easiest to miss, and they're the ones that are going to cause you the most problem in the long run for your whole population to get out of control. So here a little bit about reproductive rate, and there were slides previous to this, but generation usually of 2 spots is 5 to 15 days. They can have 7 to 10 generations per season, depending on where you are. And then if you go above 91 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, it can tighten up in as much as 3 to 4 days. So one female can lay 90 to 110 eggs. Usually it's over a period of a month. But we'll talk about things that make that speed up even more. So when it's warmer, again, the 90s or so, you can dump out 300 eggs from one female. The eggs, again, are laid on the undersides of the leaves. They're along the veins. There's profuse webbing, and that is waterproof. So keep in mind that if the egg, you know, if you have one female, she's got 300 eggs, you know, do you want to be out there chasing motels? You really ought to be thinking about how can I get the best possible coverage against eggs. That is really the thing.
I don't know how scientific it is, but there's a chart somewhere that shows you can go from 2 mites to 1 million mites in 10 days at the right temperature. Al, you probably showed it to me.
So the point is, you know, it's eggs. The next thing I talk about a little bit is dispersal, and we already talked about this ballooning, and I've seen this on my mite cultures and so forth. And what triggers this behavior? There's several things that trigger it. Usually it's, again, the substrate that they're on. If there's a lot of feeding on that leaf and the leaf starts to lose its food value, the plant gets stressed. Generally what they do is move towards the upper part of the plant. If it's a strawberry crown, it would be on higher leaves. But generally, it could be just a leaf, too, and they could move to the edge of the leaf margin. And the female, as you can see here, will actually stand. Normally, their body is down right flat on the leaf surface. They will lift themselves up. They'll actually put their legs up in the air, and it only takes a wind of a couple of meters per second, which is a pretty, you know, soft wind. And that piece of web that they're dragging behind them, they'll get blown right off that leaf and they get carried on the wind. They've sampled them a couple, 20,000 feet up in the atmosphere, sampling spider mites and stuff traveling on the winds and going.
Sounds like we need some drones.
I had a good story too when I was out in California. You know, we were treating walnut trees and we were treating it with another one of our chemicals, omite, and it's repellent. It's very repellent. So the guy came through and he did this spray and it started to repel the mites and stir them up. It was California, it was really hot. And adjacent to that field there was a cotton field. And you could sit in that car and you could watch the webbing going across the street and going in that cotton field. And we went on our tour. We came back through that area less than a week later. And I'm telling you, it looked like somebody took napalm to that cotton field. It was unbelievable how many mites migrated across and ballooned into that field. The next thing I'd talk about, oops, did I cover all of these? The dispersal. Okay, so they come in on transplants. That's how they could come in. They could walk into your field. They could be on weeds in adjacent infested fields and walk in. They could be carried into the fields on workers or machinery. And of course, ballooning is very important too. So those are all the different ways you can have the mites getting into your field to get started. Scouting, really, really important. Probably one of the #1 reasons why some of these failures happen. You have to develop a good sampling program, monitor weekly. You could even monitor sooner than that, more often if it's hot especially. Sample the entire field, look for hot spots especially. Make your applications at or before threshold, and that's really important, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the threshold per leaflet, if you start to go through recommendations there, you know, and they talk about a lot of different levels, early season, late season, and so forth. Usually I like to recommend about 5 mites per leaf, and that's not just strawberries, that's a lot of different crops. 5 mites per leaflet, and they say 5 to 10 later, but I'll tell you in a second why that's, if you wait till you get more mites, it's going to be a problem. So there was a study that I did, and it lasted 2 years, and we went to Japan and Korea, and we looked at spider mites, and we wanted to see why were we getting these populations that weren't being controlled, the eggs, and it had to do with acromite. And what happened was two separate chemical companies worked on it, and we all came to the same conclusion. There's actually a level at which, and this would apply to almost, you know, a whole bunch of different miticides that have activity against eggs and motils. And there is a level at which, if you let these mites get to it, and it's about 15 mites per leaflet, once they go above that, the eggs, there's just so many eggs that they will get out of control, and even if you have really good coverage, you can have an issue, you know, getting them back into control. So if you go to the acromite label, you go to the kenemite label, you go to University of Florida recommendations for scouting, you start looking at all these different pieces of literature, and you talk about, you know, usually the first sentence that they say in there is treat the mites early before they reach threshold. This one is on spray coverage, of course, higher spray volumes. If you look at recommendations for most of, like kenemite, acromite, and some of the other ones, it usually says 100 gallons or more to achieve, you know, a full enough volume so that you could actually coat that foliage. Very, very important, especially when you got lots of eggs out there, or in a very hot year where you know there's a lot of mites in there. Also slow down, get those leaves moving. You know the mites are underneath the leaves. You know there's a lot of webbing in there. Webbing is waterproof. The leaves can get tented. They tend to lay the eggs right along that mid vein. And if you've ever ripped any of the, you know, those leaves off and really took a good look at them, you'll see all the eggs are lined up in there. So they're really tough to get unless you're going really, really slow and you're really putting that spray coverage out there well. You want to target the eggs wherever you can. The motils, don't forget, again, they can walk onto a treated surface. You'll get benefits from residual. Almost all the miticides are going to kill motil forms, so, you know, it's not the motils that you worry about in general. It's not getting the eggs. That's what's going to kill you in the long run, because generally there's exponentially more of those than there is the motil forms, so really target those eggs. Monitor the coverage where the eggs are. So in other words, if you go in there, it's nice to have you ever seen that water sensitive paper? You know, you can go to a strawberry crown throughout your field and you could take a little piece of that paper. You could go to leaves that are close to the ground on the inside of the crown, and you could paper clip those right to the bottom of the leaf, and then when you go through after you've sprayed, you look at those, and if there's lots of mite eggs on there, you want to make sure that paper is all dark. In other words, you painted that leaf. If you're not painting that leaf, then that tells you what's going to happen coming down the road, okay? So you also, the last thing is you want to evaluate the treatments 1 to 2 days after and see if you did the trick or you didn't do the trick, and especially when you're monitoring, go ahead and look to see if you've in fact killed the eggs.